In this series of videos on Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the aim is to help you have an even better understanding of the text so that you can produce an outstanding essay in your A-level examination. Each video will contain two different sections. In the first, you'll be asked to pick out 5 key moments from the text before I do the same, and then 5 key quotations before I do the same. By watching this video, the aim is you have an even more detailed understanding into the key characters and the ideas and themes in the novel as a whole. This video is about Elinor. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare. There's no point just sitting back passively watching a YouTube revision guide and expecting magic to happen. It won't. You need to be active and doing something. So here's the first task to get you thinking in more detail about dear Elinor. Consider her role in the novel and write down 5 moments in which what she does, says or thinks is important and or interesting to you. No need to use quotations, just summarise each moment in a single sentence using your own words. So press pause now, the video will resume in 5 seconds time. And here's my list. First up, Lucy's carefully planned, highly manipulative revelations about her engagement to Edward Ferrars. Secondly, that excruciating moment when Edward is announced at Mrs. Jennings's London residence where the Dashwood sisters are staying. Little does he know that his leech-like fiancée arrived moments earlier. Thirdly, the moment when Elinor tells Marianne just how painful it has been for her having to keep cunning minx Lucy Steele's secret, knowing that it completely dashes her hopes for future happiness and perhaps, given the crucial importance of marriage for a woman of her class, future social and financial survival. Next, Elinor's reactions to Willoughby's extraordinary, self-indulgent, belated explanations are well worth scrutinising in detail. And finally, the moment when a gentle, constant love, dignity and adherence to the rules of propriety pays off. Let's now look at some extracts from these key moments. We join the exchange mid-conversation in Volume 1, Chapter 12. Elinor is still trying to compose herself following Lucy's extraordinary revelation. Read this through now, pressing pause. So what do we make of this exchange? What does it tell us about Elinor, Lucy, and the world in which they inhabit? Well, note the barbed subordinate clause, which Lucy cannot resist at the beginning of this extract, which gives us an early insight into Lucy feeling genuinely threatened by Elinor, so much so that she needs to nakedly assert her own precedence in relation to Edward's. Note also the clever way in which she alludes to Edward's attractiveness to women. Rather than open up the possibility of Edward betraying the spirit of their secret engagement by caring for another woman, we have the idea that other women, i.e. Elinor, may be drawn to him. The implication is that he is innocently devoted to her, and it isn't his fault if other women choose to fall in love with him, hence the need for this confidence to bring that hussy Elinor into line. The narrator cum Elinor is, of course, correct when she describes Lucy as naturally clever earlier in the chapter. So how does Elinor react to these manipulative, barbed revelations and comments? Well, she is genuinely shocked, and most unusually for this most self-disciplined and self-controlled of characters, she momentarily loses control. Note how fragmented her speech becomes as she tries to process the information.
Her first sentence is grammatically incomplete and merely repeats the key information provided within a bewildered exclamation. In the second sentence, she is so astonished and taken aback that she ends up stopping and restarting, a device within spoken language known as a false start. This is so unusual from someone as typically composed and eloquent as Elinor, and it highlights just how disturbed and unsettled she has become. The fact that she has to contradict and challenge Lucy's unambiguous declaration shows her need to buy more time to process the information, and also hints at the depth of her feelings for Edward. Lucy is quick to confirm the crushing of Elinor's hopes. Note her shift from the generic third person of a woman in her previous speech to the first person here. The purpose of her confidence is to safeguard and preserve her own personal happiness, which must, by definition, come at the expense of Elinor's. Given that Sense and Sensibility is largely written from Elinor's perspective, it is tempting to cast Lucy as an absolute bitch for her manipulative behaviour here, and her dogged insistence on retaining her engagement to Edward after, apparently, affection has faded on both sides. But is this fair, given the critical importance of marriage for women during this period? For women of the middle class without their own inheritance, marriage represented virtually the only opportunity of ensuring your financial and social security. One of the few alternatives for a reasonably well-accomplished rather than educated woman could be to become a governess, which, judging by Jane Fairfax's comments in Emma and the writing of the Bronte sisters, could be a dehumanising, dreadful experience. Should we therefore be too harsh as readers on Lucy, bearing in mind the paucity of options open for women at that time? No wonder perhaps this tigress bears her claws and uses all the tools available to a woman of the time to protect her territory. No wonder perhaps that love doesn't really come into it. Time for another key moment, this time in chapter 13 of volume 2. Read through this narration of how Edward, Elinor and Lucy react and behave when meeting so unexpectedly in London. Press pause now. It's notable in this extract just how useless Edward is. He is literally unmanned at finding himself alone with the woman he is engaged to marry, and the woman he respects and loves more, at least according to Elinor. He fails utterly in his social duty to maintain composure and dignity due to his inability to use phatic talk, and is clearly unequal to the challenges of maintaining a discourse, leaving him ill at ease. His fiancée, by contrast, seems at least perfectly composed and shamelessly lets the other two, principally Elinor, do all the work. In some ways, her silence resembles that of Elinor's sister Marianne, who, until her epiphany towards the end of the novel, very rarely makes any effort in awkward or, more commonly, personally uninteresting social situations. However, whereas Marianne feels she is being true to her own inner honesty and impulsivity, Lucy is far more calculating and controlled. It is Edward who is paying the visit at Elinor's residence, and so it is these two who must maintain the social dialogue, leaving her to watch cat-like and sharpen her verbal claws to be used at a later time. So Elinor has a very hard job maintaining the appearance of social ease during this encounter. But she goes one step further and really engineers a situation in which the man she loves has some time alone with the woman to whom he is engaged, a woman she essentially despises. The adverb heroically is apt indeed. Heroes don't think of themselves, they just act to help and save others. And this is what Elinor is doing here by allowing the two time alone together. Something which would have been far harder to engineer in the tightly controlled and bound society of the early 19th century. Note Austen's use of the superlatives handsomest and most high-minded, which illustrate the fact that Elinor's actions are motivated by her own high moral sense rather than self-interest. She wants above all to do the right thing, whether this is maintaining decent social decorum or allowing frustrated lovers time together, even if all of this comes at her own expense. When we think that Elinor is in a very similar situation to Lucy financially, i.e. they both have virtually nothing to offer prospective husbands, such moral selflessness is striking indeed, almost unnaturally so. But just because Elinor feels strongly that she needs to preserve a degree of self-control, particularly in social situations, but also when with her family, doesn't mean that she is an automaton. She makes this clear in this passage from Volume 3, Chapter 1, when she finally enlightens Marianne. Press pause to read this now. What is notable here is just how systematically Elinor deconstructs her sister's idea that she is someone incapable of intense feeling. She does this by recapping all the reasons she has for being unhappy. She has felt morally obliged to keep Lucy's hateful secret for such a long period of time. It was Lucy herself who told her about her engagement to Edward, leaving her forced to tolerate implicit, jealous shrieks of exultation at regular intervals. Meanwhile, both Fanny and Mrs. Ferrers have continued to see Elinor as a threat to their precious Edward, resulting in the continuance of their deeply unpleasant, condescending, downright rude behaviour. And of course, Elinor herself was enormously upset by what happened between her sister and Willoughby. Who can forget her joining her sister on her bed in unrepressed wails and lamentations? After brutally relisting reasons for unhappiness, Elinor then counters any notion that her character and desire to maintain a degree of self-control has immured her from genuine suffering. There is the verb suffer, which perhaps previously Marianne felt was her own exclusive domain. There's the phrase constant and painful exertion, which gives an insight into the enormous strain Elinor has felt every second of the waking day trying to keep herself together. There is the use of the rhetorical device anaphora in "they did not spring up, they did not occur to relieve," which builds up further emotional momentum. And there is the simplicity of the phrase "very unhappy," which allows for no doubt whatsoever. Elinor is most certainly capable of intense feeling, and just because she chooses not to broadcast it to the world doesn't make it any less real. Or, as George Haggerty puts it within his essay entitled "The Sacrifice of Privacy" in Sense and Sensibility, Elinor considers private experience in relation to the public context, while Marianne can only understand private experience in relation to itself. Elinor thinks about her relation to the world, while Marianne primarily feels it. Both women experience emotion, but Elinor is capable of feeling and contextualising. More selfish, immature Marianne can only do the feeling bit. Rather than include an extract from Willoughbys' passionate, compelling confession to Elinor late one evening at Cleveland, I want to focus on her subsequent reflections. Read through this extract from Volume 3, Chapter 9, press pause. Willoughby has essentially just confirmed to Elinor that he was a rogue. He even admitted that he initially had no intention of returning Marianne's affection during the early heady days at Barton Cottage. And yet notice Elinor's determination to think, to contextualise, to avoid overly simplistic conclusions. Once again, morally, she wants to be fair. Thus she feels burdened as she tries to work out exactly how she feels about what Willoughby has told her. In spite of the universally acknowledged as disgusting way he treated her sister, she can't help but feel compassion for him. Why? Well, because he's so good looking. Part of her, if she were brave enough to admit it, fancies him. Her compassion is also motivated by the openness and frankness of his conversation. Something which she knows can be socially destructive, but which refreshes within a world of so many formulaic, staid, boring exchanges. And of course, the fact that he clearly still loves Marianne passionately, even though a freshly married to wealth man, draws Elinor's sympathy and humanity. So this section of the text emphasises that Elinor is far, far more than a well-controlled, polite, well-bred, small-talk expert. She is capable, indeed insists on coming to her own conclusions about behaviour universally condemned by society. She is intelligent and self-reflective. Unlike Marianne, for the majority of the book, she is capable of analysing her own reactions and evolving based on her conclusions. My final key moment now, and given I'm a soppy old git, probably my favourite. It's that happy moment you've all been waiting for. Press pause to read now. What is so interesting here is Elinors Silence. Unusually for someone who, throughout the novel, has taken the responsibility to lead and speak during both tedious and difficult social situations, she says nothing. But she is feeling everything, such intense anxiety that she is left disorientated and discombobulated, which later morphs into vigorous impulsive disorder. She exits the room abruptly without saying anything to anyone, and then fully fledged weeping. The conclusion we as readers must make is that the novel's title is Sense and Sensibility, not Sense or Sensibility. All of us need to manage and fuse these potentially competing qualities within the public and private spheres. There is nothing wrong with sensibility, with feeling, but this should not be the be-all and end-all. Elinor thus gets her reward for her steadfast devotion and good social sense throughout the novel, the fulfilment of her own private sensibilities. What we see in this extract here is a very rare public glimpse of what has always been present just beneath the surface. By exploring key moments from the novel, we've come to a closer understanding of Elinor's character and the society she inhabits. However, for the exam, you will need to be able to wheel out actual quotations, giving even more specific individual insight. So, time for your second task. Take some time rereading sections of the novel before writing out 5 quotations which give different insight into what this more complex than meets the eye character is really like. In order to ensure that you are revising as many different sections of the novel as possible, avoid quotations or sections of the text which have been used so far in this video. Press pause to get started. Here's my first quotation. Elinor, this eldest daughter, whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment, which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counsellor of her mother, and enabled her frequently to counteract to the advantage of them all that eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood which must generally have led to imprudence. This comes very early on in the novel, and it confirms the level of responsibility Elinor needs to shoulder while still a teenager. She is the one who stops her mother storming off in a huff following Fanny's insensitively rapid arrival at Norland following the death of her father. She is the one who ensures that her mother doesn't take on a house that they can't afford. So effectively, she is the single parent and has to try to manage the decisions of the family as a whole so that they somehow maintain a respectable level of gentility and financial security. Something incredibly difficult to do in a world in which all the odds are set up in favour of men and eldest sons in particular. On to my second quotation. That the hair was her own, she instantaneously felt as well satisfied as Marianne. The only difference in their conclusions was that what Marianne considered as a free gift from her sister, Elinor was conscious must have been procured by some theft or contrivance unknown to herself. This is an interesting one. The context is that Edward has belatedly pitched up at Barton Cottage and is spotted wearing a ring with a plait of hair in the centre. Marianne asks whether it is his sister Fanny's hair, and blushing and looking very suspicious, Edward agrees that it is. However, Elinor, like her sister Marianne, believes that it must be her own hair, which Edward has somehow, by some theft or contrivance, got hold of. Let's think about this closely. Just how easy is it to get hold of someone else's hair within today's world? And now think about Austen's world, a place in which an unengaged single man and a single woman would not even be permitted to be alone together. Assuming that Elinor's hair was not prone to extensive moulting, how on earth would Edward have been able to get hold of a stray lock or two? And so what I take from this quotation is a point about the society Elinor inhabits. She is the epitome of sense, virtually all the way through the novel. Yet the fact such an intelligent, rational woman could come to such an unlikely conclusion, which is confirmed as wrong when Lucy Steele reveals later it is her hair, gives an insight into the instinctive desperation of women within a patriarchal world. The vast majority of women have to marry simply to survive, and this necessity would have been bored into young girls from a very young age, as exemplified by the wails of the much maligned, but actually on point, Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Knowing just how essential marriage is to her and her sister's future survival may have warped Elinor's usually impeccable judgment here. Most unusually for her, this is wish fulfillment rather than habitual sense. My third, I love to see children full of life and spirits. I cannot bear them if they are tame and quiet. This is Lucy Steele. I confess, replied Elinor, that while I am at Barton Park, I never think of tame and quiet children with any abhorrence. The context here is that the Middleton children have just been carted out of the room, having been a pain in the backside. A pin slightly scratched one of the children's neck, resulting in violent screams and over-the-top unnecessary alarm from Lady Middleton, joined by both Steele sisters. The implication from the narrative is that the child clearly enjoyed all the attention and so carried on screaming and even kicked two of her brothers. The joy here is the neat symmetrical way Elinor throws Lucy's characteristically sycophantic words back at her. The context suggests that the children are not just full of life and spirits, but are overindulged and annoyingly impose upon the lives of all around them, including guests. Rather than directly contradict Lucy, Elinor uses the same adjectives tame and quiet in an understated positive context, resulting in a humorous riposte. This is Elinor at her quick-witted, dead leaves finest. She shows that she is proud and independent enough not to suck up and to imply the truth without breaking the rules of propriety. It is a delicate balancing act, but one which she does repeatedly throughout the novel, particularly when speaking to those either on the same social level or a rung lower. My fourth, allow me to congratulate you on having so respectable and well-judging of friends, and to join in his wish that the living, 'tis about 200 a year, were much more considerable, and such as might better enable you to, as might be more than a temporary accommodation to yourself, such in short, as might establish all your views of happiness. The context here is that Elinor has the unenviable task of telling the man she loves that a friend of hers, Colonel Brandon, is willing to offer him the living of Delaford Parsonage. This is enormously significant as it provides the cut-off Edward Ferrars a means of supporting himself and potentially marrying Lucy Steele. £200 a year is low, certainly, although Mrs. Jennings feels that it could just be sufficient for a couple. Edward Copeland points out that Austen's own parents married on a similar income, although it was difficult maintaining the appearance of gentility. So even though the figure is relatively low, this is a painful message for Elinor to pass on, and her pain and her agitation manifest itself in her hesitations and another false starts. She cannot bring herself to use the dreaded word marry in relation to Edward and Lucy, and so she stops herself and instead refers more generically to the opportunity possibly being more than a temporary accommodation. Generosity of spirit and self-sacrificial goodwill shine through Elinor's words. Whereas Lucy prefers to use the first person, Elinor's use of the second person here shows that she is thinking solely of Edward's future well-being. She's almost too good to be true, isn't she? My final quotation. Marianne restored to life, health, friends, and to her doting mother was an idea to fill her heart with sensations of exquisite comfort and expand it in fervent gratitude. But it led to no outward demonstrations of joy, no words, no smiles. All within Elinor's breast was satisfaction, silent and strong. After the apothecary, Mr. Harris's confirmation that Marianne was highly likely to make a full recovery, Elinor is overjoyed and grateful. But she doesn't need to broadcast this to the world or shout, sing and scream. She is one who experiences emotion as much as the rest of us, but prefers to do it largely inwardly. There is something gloriously understated and indeed masculine about the description of her breast as containing satisfaction, silent and strong. The sibilance binds the words together, whilst the positioning of the adjectives after the noun gives a quasi-poetic feel. Meanwhile, the image of the strong and silent breast brings the male hero of romantic lore to mind. In many ways, this is appropriate. Devoid of a close male authority figure following the death of her father, Elinor has had to take on both the maternal and paternal roles within her family. It has been a struggle, but her constant efforts and calm propriety are rewarded in a typically Austen-esque fairy tale ending. She gets the man she has always loved and the money. Perfect combination.
It looks like we've come to the end of this video exploring character within Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. I hope it's been useful. Many thanks for watching.